The year is 1912. The European continent is on the brink of war. Behind closed doors, Europe is secretly splitting into two armed camps. The Allied powers, composed of Great Britain, France, Russia, and after 1915, Italy, against the Central Powers of Germany, Austria-Hungary, Turkey, and Bulgaria. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic Ocean, the United States elects a new president, Woodrow Wilson. Wilson and his fellow progressive reformers believe they can remake the world in such a way as to make war obsolete. So, in spite of the growing tensions in Europe, Woodrow Wilson chooses William Jennings Bryan, a pacifist, a believer in peace, to be his Secretary of State. But this idealistic view of the world will not be enough to alter the course Europe has chosen to take. In 1914, the powder keg explodes. Serbian terrorists assassinate Franz Ferdinand, the heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne. The assassination sets off a chain reaction that spreads throughout Europe. After Austria declares war on Serbia on July 28th, one nation after another is drawn into the conflict. Russia, which has a secret treaty with Serbia, prepares for war against Austria. Germany then declares war on Russia and Russia's ally, France, then invades Belgium to bypass French defenses. On August 4th, Great Britain declares war on Germany, and 2 days later, Russia and Austria-Hungary formally enter the conflict. Thus begins a war that would change the world forever. Europe pours its scientific genius and vast industrial power into the production of new weapons of mass destruction. Long-range, high-velocity rifles and artillery, machine guns, poison gas, tanks, and airplanes turn war into a nightmare of death and devastation. By the end of the first year of the war, 25,000 miles of heavily fortified trenches spiderweb a course stretching from Belgium to Austria. As in all wars, the foot soldier is the decisive focus of gains and losses. In senseless, suicidal charges into the no-man's land between the trenches, hundreds of thousands of soldiers are mowed down by artillery fire, machine guns, or choked by poison gas.
As far as you could see, there were all these bodies lying there. Literally thousands of them. Some without legs. Some were legs without bodies. Arms without bodies. A terrible sight. It didn't seem possible. It didn't get inside me or scare me, but it just made me wonder that these could have been men. It made me wonder what it was all about.
When the Great War begins, Americans see no reason to get involved on either side. President Wilson calls for the United States to be neutral in fact as well as in name, impartial in thought as well as in action. Preferring to avoid any entanglements that might threaten the nation's moral integrity and independence, the United States, since the time of George Washington, pursues a policy of isolationism with regards to Europe. The United States has many immigrants from nations on both sides of the conflict, including some 10 million with ties to Germany or Austria-Hungary. Prominent Americans of all political persuasions want the U.S. to stay out of the conflict. Progressives like Jane Addams speak out against war as an instrument of national policy.
In fact, in 1914, some women marched in black down the streets of the Fifth Avenue protesting the war. At the same time, some young men couldn't wait to get in and dropped out of college, dropped out of high school, became ambulance drivers or joined the French Foreign Legion. It was a great adventure, and if you got left out, you'd get left out of the greatest adventure of your lifetime.
Practically the entire political left, led by Eugene Debs and the Socialist Party, condemned the war as capitalist imperialism. Even prominent industrialists, including Andrew Carnegie and Henry Ford, who bankrolled anti-war activities, believed that entering the war would be a grave mistake. Ford, in fact, spends almost $500,000 in December 1915 to send more than 100 men and women on a peace ship to Europe in the hope of negotiating an end to the war. But the war would not be ended by symbolic gestures. U.S. business profited handsomely from supplying food and arms to the combatants on both sides. But both the British and the Germans pressured U.S. businesses to stop trading with their enemies. By the end of 1914, a British naval blockade in the North Atlantic intercepts all ships bound for the Central Powers. After that, U.S. trade with England and France grows, while trade with the Central Powers declines.
So many Americans said, you know, let the Europeans just do it themselves. We don't want to get involved. But as the years went by, American banks lent more and more money to the Allies. And the American economy got more and more involved with the Allied side.
Increasingly desperate to end the blockade, the German Navy launches a devastating new weapon, the U-boat, and in February 1915 announces its own naval blockade of Great Britain. In early May, a U-boat sinks the British passenger liner Lusitania off the coast of Ireland, killing 128 Americans. The United States is on the brink of war. Americans are outraged by the German attack. But Wilson and Congress resist the urge for revenge. In 1916, Woodrow Wilson is re-elected President of the United States under the slogan, "He kept us out of war." On January 31st, 1917, Germany resumes unrestricted submarine attacks. Tensions mount further when the United States learns that Germany has secretly urged Mexico to join the war against the United States. In return, Germany promises to help Mexico recover all the lands it had lost in the Mexican-American War. Throughout March 1917, U-boats sink U.S. ships without warning.
The Germans thought they could bring Britain and France to their knees more quickly if Britain and France weren't getting goods from the United States. And it's the submarine warfare which propels Wilson to make war. And he's come to believe by 1917 that the United States can't live with a German victory, that it's going to change our political economy. We're not going to be able to trade with the Germans. We're not going to be able to deal with an anti-democratic country like he thought Germany was.
On April 2nd, 1917, Wilson appears before a special session of Congress to ask for a declaration of war.
The world must be made safe for democracy. We have no selfish ends to serve. We desire no conquest, no dominion. We seek no indemnities for ourselves, no material compensation for the sacrifices we shall freely make. We are but one of the champions of the rights of mankind.
The United States enters the war, woefully unprepared for combat. There are only 200,000 men in uniform in early 1917. After Congress's declaration of war, 1 million men volunteer to serve their country. To field an army, Congress passes the Selective Service Act, which quickly drafts an additional 3 million young men into the military. So who are the young American doughboys? The typical inductee is single, 22 years old, 5 feet 7 inches tall, 141 pounds. 1 in 5 are foreign-born. 400,000 are African American. 1 out of 3 are so unhealthy they flunk their physicals. 1 out of 3 can't read or write. So many are ignorant of the reasons they are going to war that worried government officials place a copy of the president's war message in every soldier's knapsack. One of the ways Wilson convinces opponents of the war to accept a draft is by arguing that it will speed the Americanization of immigrants.
The military tent, where they all sleep side by side, will rank next to the public school among the great agents of democratization. Theodore Roosevelt.
Progressive reformers used the war as an opportunity to heighten moral standards.
The progressives thought that the Army was a wonderful chance to educate a large number of people. At the same time, they tried to influence the soldiers to prevent them from drinking, which was a progressive measure, prohibition. Their belief was that they could train these soldiers so that when they came back to civilian life, they would be better citizens.
Men must live straight if they are to shoot straight, cautioned Secretary of the Navy Josephus Daniels. To conserve grain necessary for food, a wartime prohibition on the manufacture of alcoholic beverages goes into effect in 1917. While the Army is training new soldiers, the nation works around the clock, pouring its energy and resources into the war effort. Wars cost a tremendous amount of money. To pay for the war, Congress passes new taxes on corporate profits and imposes stiff personal income taxes for the first time. Rallied by Hollywood stars, Americans of all classes buy Liberty bonds to help win the war. The federal government mobilizes the entire American economy, taking unprecedented control through a series of boards and agencies.
The government sets up a war industries board and brings in executives from top corporations to supervise the conversion of American factories and shops from a peacetime to a wartime economy. And there's a very close cooperation between business and government that will continue after the war ends.
The new Fuel Administration allocates the coal resources necessary for operation of the nation's railroads and factories. The Railroad War Board takes over and coordinates the nation's sprawling transportation system. Perhaps the most successful government agency is the Food Administration, which under the slogan, "Food will win the war," dramatically increases domestic production of wheat and other grains from 45 million acres in 1917 to 75 million in 1919. Campaigns to serve just enough and use all leftovers, wheatless Mondays, meatless Tuesdays, and porkless Thursdays and Saturdays result in substantial conservation of food resources. It not only puts cheap food on American tables, but also war-torn Europe. The nation's workers also benefit as the new National War Labor Board arbitrates labor disputes, establishes an 8-hour day for war workers, and also endorses equal pay for women workers. Production soars as American factories pour out clothing, munitions, and ships in record time. Factories working round the clock require unprecedented numbers of workers.
The Great War had a tremendous impact on migration of people in the country, partly because of the fact that the war had cut off immigration from Europe, and there was great need for workers.
So American businessmen face a dilemma. Where are they going to get the workers for their factories? And the place they find them is among African Americans in the South, who up until the First World War had been excluded from industrial employment except as strikebreakers. So with these new opportunities, you have the beginnings of what becomes known as the Great Migration.
more than 400,000 African American men and women head north to the industrial cities. The Great Migration, unleashed by the First World War, continues throughout the 1920s, as more than 1.5 million men and women seek new lives in urban areas of the United States. During the Great War, about 1 million women also joined the labor force for the first time, and many of the nation's 8 million working women switched from low-paying domestic service to higher-paying industrial jobs. Women's contributions to the war effort pushed their campaign for suffrage to its successful conclusion with ratification of the 19th Amendment in 1920. The World War brings to women the right to vote. To win the war, the nation needs to mobilize people's minds as well as their bodies. The Wilson administration sets up the CPI, the Committee on Public Information, to rally Americans' support of the Allied cause. The CPI passes out 75 million pieces of patriotic literature and trains hundreds of volunteers, called 4-Minute Men, to give speeches in movie theaters. The CPI's mind mobilization campaigns help to whip the public into a frenzy of patriotism and contribute to a climate of suspicion and anti-German hysteria.
Suddenly, when the war broke out and the United States found itself fighting Germany, the Germans were turned from being representatives of culture and civilization to being barbaric Huns. So an anti-German feeling took over the country to the point where people started changing street names from Kaiser Avenue to Wilson Street. German measles was outlawed and became Liberty measles. Sauerkraut was outlawed and became Liberty cabbage. German music was banned from symphony halls. The German language was forbidden to be taught in American high schools. Some Germans were even lynched.
Vigilante groups like the American Protective League mobilized close to 250,000 self-appointed agents to spy on their neighbors and fellow workers. Law enforcement officials tolerate little criticism of American values and institutions during wartime. Perceiving opposition to government policies as treason, the Wilson administration passes the Espionage Act of 1917 and the Sedition Act of 1918, which lets the government crack down on dissenters. The government prosecutes more than 2,000 people under these laws, including socialist labor leader Eugene Debs, who receives a 10-year prison term for a speech accusing the United States of imperialism for entering the war. Few Americans protest government violation of the Bill of Rights. The country's attention is focused overseas on the exploits of the U.S. Expeditionary Force. To head the American Expeditionary Force, President Wilson selects General John J. Blackjack Pershing, a tough career soldier who had led the army that pursued Pancho Villa into Mexico in 1916. In June 1917, the first 15,000 American doughboys arrive in France, just in time to join the French and English in defense against a massive German offensive. On the Eastern Front, Germany pounds Russia into submission. In March 1917, the Russian monarchy collapses. Promising peace, land, and bread, Bolshevik revolutionaries, led by Vladimir Lenin, take control of the world's largest nation and establish the world's first communist government. The new Russian government then pulls out of the war and signs the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk with Germany on March 3, 1918. Concentrating all its forces on the Western Front, the Germans in March 1918 launch a major offense and by May advanced within 50 miles of Paris. American soldiers see their first action helping the French repel the Germans in the battles of Chateau Thierry and Belleau Wood. In mid-July, U.S. soldiers help spearhead a counteroffensive that drives back the Germans to their final defensive stand at the Meuse-Argonne forest. Fresh U.S. troops and supplies turn the tide. Demoralized and out of supplies, Germany calls for peace. By the time it's over, the Great War claims the lives of 8 million soldiers and close to 7 million civilians. During the 18 months of the United States involvement, close to 51,000 American servicemen are killed in action. Another 60,000 die from other causes, mainly an influenza pandemic that sweeps the world in 1918, killing 500,000 American civilians and close to 20 million people worldwide. On the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month in 1918, in a railroad car nestled in the forest of Compiègne, France, the final armistice is negotiated. The war is over. President Wilson arrives in France with his own idealistic 14-point plan that he hopes will serve as a blueprint for the post-war world. The plan includes a call for the end of secret diplomacy, freedom of the seas, elimination of trade barriers, arms reduction, and the right of nations controlled by European powers to political self-determination. His last point, which he views as a mechanism for achieving all the others, is an international League of Nations, a forum in which the nations of the world can settle their disputes without resorting to war. But the Allied leaders had other ideas. Georges Clemenceau of France and Britain's David Lloyd George lust for revenge and are offended by Wilson's self-righteous moralizing. Ignoring Wilson's proposal, the victors carve up their former enemies' territories. In order to see his League of Nations become a reality, Wilson gives in to French and British demands for a war guilt clause, blaming Germany for the war. Reparations, to be paid to the French and British by Germany, are later set at $33 billion. Wilson's moralism gets him into further difficulties in Russia. Opposed to Lenin's new order, the president joins other nations in an economic and naval blockade of the Soviet Union and sends U.S. troops to Russia to help overthrow the Bolsheviks. The troops remain until 1920, souring Soviet-American relations for the next 2 decades. When he returns home in 1919, Wilson meets stiff Senate opposition to the peace treaty. To get it ratified, he takes his case to the people of the United States. But the strain of an extensive speaking tour proves too much for the ailing 62-year-old president. Wilson collapses from a stroke in Pueblo, Colorado in late September, and a week later suffers a second massive stroke that leaves him paralyzed on one side of his body. Wilson's stubbornness causes another paralysis. The United States never does sign the Versailles Treaty or join the League of Nations. And by 1920, the nation is facing other, more immediate problems.
African Americans played an important role in World War I. They were not usually in combat units. They were usually in auxiliary roles in the war. But they were part of the American Expeditionary Forces in France that helped win World War I. And they found that they were better received often in France, let's say in Paris, than they were in American cities. They knew that they had fought to keep the world safe for democracy, as Woodrow Wilson phrased it, and yet at home they weren't first-class citizens.
And so when black soldiers came back, they were liable to be lynched, that is, to be murdered, even in their uniforms, because there was so much fear about what they would do with their renewed sense of their own humanity.
Wartime inflation sends the cost of living soaring. When the booming economy slumps in 1919 as it strains to convert to peacetime production, more than 4 million workers, 1 out of every 5, go on strike, a proportion never since equaled.
So we have economic competition after the war and also a very tense racial situation. And the two of those together produced what was called the Red Summer of 1919, in which there were something like 20 racial outbreaks, the biggest in Chicago.
The National Guard is called in after days of shooting and fighting leaves 30 dead and more than 500 people wounded. The strikes of 1919 rocked the nation. Shipyard workers in Seattle, clothing workers in New York, and soft coal miners in West Virginia all strike for better wages and shorter work weeks. In September, 300,000 steel workers leave their jobs and shut down the industry. The steel companies strike back with a vengeance, beating and shooting strikers. To gain public support, the companies portray the strikes not as labor disputes, but as an attempted revolution inspired by foreign radicals.
When the war ends, Americans were unable to turn off their fear of foreigners. And as strikes and labor actions paralyzed the nation in 1919, the belief became widespread that communists and socialists and other people deemed subversives or anti-American were causing problems. They are rounded up in what becomes known as the Red Scare. After a bomb explodes outside the home of Attorney General A. Mitchell Palmer, Palmer stages a series of raids.
The government made raids on people that they considered radical or subversive or un-American. And for quite a long time, anybody who tried to criticize the government or suggest that maybe things could be done in a different way were simply denounced as un-American. Some people had been put in prison during the war for simply questioning certain things that the government was doing. So it was a time of great hysteria.
The nativist sentiment peaks right after the war. Those thinking of themselves as 100% Americans are repulsed at the sight of some 800,000 immigrants stepping ashore in 1920 and 1921, most of them from Southern and Eastern Europe.
Right after World War I, we get things like the KKK, the Ku Klux Klan, is an example of a largely Protestant group fearing blacks, Italians, Jews, the organization of super American societies that praise America and want to resist anything else. So it's an exaggerated feeling of patriotism. That's what nativism is.
The fear of foreigners unleashed by the war continues without challenge into the 1920s. In 1921, Congress passes an Emergency Quota Act to stem the flow of immigrants. Later, more restrictive legislation cuts the flood of immigrants to America's shores to a trickle for decades to come.
In the aftermath, the United States was one of the strongest countries in the Western world, and for the first time became a creditor nation as opposed to a debtor nation. That is to say that more money was owed to Americans than Americans owed to other people. So this is the beginning of the United States becoming the premier economic power in the world.
Encouraged by government wartime policies, big business is bigger than ever. Culturally, the war intensifies the deep divisions in society and fuels the resurgence of nativism. It also continues certain progressive era reforms, adding 2 amendments to the Constitution, giving women the right to vote, and outlawing the manufacture, sale, or distribution of alcoholic beverages. Weary of crusades and war, Americans faced the 1920s hoping for a return to normalcy, but unclear as to what the new post-war world will bring.